This right here is the American Embassy in Canberra, but right next door is the Australian Parliament. On the way home from work, politicians don't even have to drive 5 minutes to be in America. Within an hour, a one-on-one conversation in a meeting room could be relayed back to Washington. And so this guy, Senator Mark Arbib, was known for taking the scenic route home. In fact, the embassy even wrote to Washington in glowing terms, noting just how helpful Mark Arbib had been. And in June of 2010, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd met with his deputy Julia Gillard for 2 hours. She was expressing concerns with his leadership, but it had appeared he had talked her out of a leadership challenge. That was until they took a brief recess and she made a call. So who on earth was on that phone call? Well, I think you know the answer.
Labour Senator Mark Arbib has been named as a regular confidential source for the United States Embassy in Canberra.
Senator Arbib reported to the US Embassy in Canberra about confidential workings inside of the Labour Party machine.
Now, if America really did get rid of Kevin Rudd, that is huge. But a good way to approach a conspiracy is just to first actually consider whether or not the original narrative is compelling by itself. Gillard gave 2 reasons to justify her challenge. 1, the Rudd government had become dysfunctional, and 2, they were simply on track to lose the election.
I asked my colleagues to make a leadership change. A change because I believed that a good government was losing its way. I love this country and I was not going to sit idly by and watch an incoming opposition cut education, cut health, and smash rights at work.
I do think it's a compelling case. At the end of 2009, Rudd's stock was sky high. His Labour Party was smashing the Liberals in the polls. But if we draw a timeline from then to the fall, those 6 months do seem to support Gillard's case. And we'll start right here with the emissions trading scheme. So Rudd had been elected on a promise to tackle climate change.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
But if Rudd just threw his weight around and taxed carbon polluters, he'd alienate the business community in his first term. Instead, he wanted to make climate change an opportunity for clean businesses to get rich. If the top 1,000 businesses were given 100,000 carbon permits, unused permits could be sold to those who had gone overboard. Effectively, this created a market for carbon. Across the aisle, the opposition leader Malcolm Turnbull voiced his support for the scheme, but not everyone was on board. The Liberals' partner, the National Party, opposed it.
I have the deepest respect for Malcolm, and I deeply believe that he believes that he's doing the right thing, but on this issue, the National Party has not been convinced.
The heavily pro-mining group in his own Liberal Party also voiced their opposition. While the scheme would benefit most businesses, it would mean that carbon-heavy businesses like mining companies would be buying permits off of the rest of them. Turnbull felt stuck, and so he demanded a leadership contest. If you go with me, we do the ETS, and if you go with someone else, have a go at blocking it. Tony Abbott edged out Turnbull by 1 vote. In the Senate, he then teamed up with the Greens. The Greens felt the scheme didn't go far enough and wanted a hard tax on pollution. And so for completely opposite reasons, they voted down the ETS at the end of 2009. Now, this was frustrating in of itself. One of his signature policies got blocked. But this also ruined his trip to Denmark. In Copenhagen, the world gathered to try and nut out some actionable steps on what to do about climate change. Rudd felt that he had a golden solution with the ETS, and he was pumped to show off his new toy. But now he obviously couldn't. The negotiations went poorly, and at one stage, America and China had left the session, leaving Kevin Rudd to lead the meeting. Without the main characters, it was tough to get anything done. Rudd really had to fight tooth and nail to get the remaining countries to agree to a statement. The UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown actually said that was pretty impressive. But having come in with such high hopes, it was certainly a lot less than Rudd had envisioned. So Gillard's argument was that from that point onwards, Rudd just mentally wasn't with it. Anakin Skywalker was dead, and now Darth Vader was leading the meetings. Now, it's no secret that Rudd had a temper.
This language, he's just complicates it.
But Gillard's specific argument was that he was impossible to work with and incapable of making big decisions, calling him personally miserable, politically paralysed. The health minister, Nicola Roxon, very much backs this up and said that he was very dismissive of people's work when the ministers met. As 2010 progressed, this only got worse. Rudd had abandoned John Howard's policy of detaining asylum seekers on foreign soil, instead processing them on Australian territory. As illegal refugees came in increasing droves, this knocked his popularity. At the same time, there was a tragedy that could be linked to a Rudd policy. As part of its response to the global financial crisis, Rudd spent $1.5 billion installing more insulation into people's homes. The theory was that this put people into work while also reducing heating costs down the track. Unfortunately, 4 workers died. 3 were electrocuted and 1 died from heat stress. Rudd had no other choice but to abandon the scheme. So at this point right here, some in the Labor Party were making a backup plan for if Rudd continued to slide. One of them was the mafia don himself, Don Farrell, but with him were 2 other senators. At this point, they discussed the idea of installing Gillard. But this was still 2 months out from D-Day. Things would have to get a lot worse before action was taken. And 2 weeks later, they did. Unable to negotiate with the Greens, Rudd had decided to dump the ETS until after the upcoming election in just a few months' time. Dropping a policy is never good for the optics, but the polls weren't the main concern. One of his ministers, Tony Burke, found out in the paper. Suffice to say that he was pretty peeved. As we moved into May, it just got worse and worse for Rudd. Rudd had lost 11 points on who was considered the preferred Prime Minister, and the numbers seem to suggest that nearly 1 million voters had been lost in just a few weeks. Put those 2 things together, and Tony Burke wanted to see heads roll. According to Burke, he wanted to give Gillard plausible deniability. Burke went to find the Deputy Prime Minister and said to her, "There's one issue we haven't spoken about. If you ever want to raise it with me, don't hesitate." Now, at the same time, May of 2010, another person in the Labor Party was starting to make quiet moves. Bill Shorten. He was a superstar in the Labor movement for helping rescue the Beaconsfield miners that were trapped in a rockfall.
Oh, it's sinking in. You don't realise how close you get to these things, and I was probably quite affected by it. I'm really, really happy.
Rudd had left him out of his cabinet and didn't give him the rank of minister. Shorten himself was a Victorian and argued that if they were going to win the 2010 election, they needed to win some of these marginal seats down here. But if you have a closer look at the map, this seat right here was safely held by Julia Gillard. There was a real argument that having Gillard as leader would make for a very great strategic play. Now, when I was in school, the jocks sat here, the Skrillex crew sat here, and then the peasants, which was me, sat here. Pretty much all of my friends were in the peasants. But the ones that I was particularly close to were the ones that were also addicted to FIFA. My point is this: my friendship was first defined by geography and then by ideology. It was really no different in Labor. Alliances first existed at the state level because you'd get into the party through your local branch, and then from there, at least usually, you'd choose either left or right. The New South Wales right faction were definitely the jocks, and had previously produced a Labor king in Paul Keating and a Labor kingmaker in Graham Richardson. And at least in my opinion, far more than Julia Gillard herself, the New South Wales right faction wanted the head of Kevin Rudd. A senator from the faction called Sam Dastyari personally ordered polling on those key Victorian marginal seats. It came back pretty grim. The only positive was that Gillard's personal polling was really strong there. Dastyari reported this back to his New South Wales right ally, Mark Arbib. And once this reaches Arbib, things really get moving. Gillard sent an email to Rudd expressing her concern with backlash to his policies and had BCC'd Mark Arbib on the email. Clearly, they'd been talking, much like Ben, PY and I on the podcast. Just click follow and give it a rating. This episode right here will teach you all about the New South Wales right faction. But by this point, Kevin Rudd was aware that a coup might be brewing. The Sydney Morning Herald released an article claiming that Rudd had ordered internal polling on the leadership. He was then going to use this as leverage to make his case to the party as to why they should keep him. At this, Gillard felt utter betrayal and called Tony Burke to her office. Like with Arbib and Dastyari, Burke belonged to the New South Wales right faction. He told her that Rudd had left her with 2 options: resign or challenge. Gillard went for the latter, and Burke offered to start making calls, which was an offer that Gillard accepted. This all happened on June the 23rd. In fact, on that night, Rudd clearly knew that knives were sharpening, and he asked Gillard to his office. Gillard never denied that she was considering a challenge, and Rudd pleaded with her to reconsider. Look at this graph right here. By this point, Labor had somewhat recovered from the month before and was up by 4 points on the two-party preferred poll. Howard and Keating had both won their second term from lower margins. Rudd's final appeal was to let him step down on his terms. If he felt that he couldn't win the election, he would step down as he had no ambitions of taking the party back into opposition. Gillard seemed to be somewhat okay with that proposal. The meeting had gone on for 2 hours, so they took a brief recess and Julia Gillard made a call. The person on the other line was Mark Arbib, and after getting off the phone, Gillard decided to challenge, leaving Rudd until the morning to scramble and get numbers. One of his first calls was to his treasurer, Wayne Swan. Rudd was the godfather of Swan's child, and they went to the same school in Queensland. But that wasn't enough to save Rudd. Swan told him that he didn't have the numbers, and so Rudd resigned the leadership. So I reckon there's a pretty compelling case that Rudd was worn down, dysfunctional, and on track to lose the 2010 election. But I do think that it's a more compelling case that it was something else. In the ABC's Killing Season documentary, Chris Bowen, a man from the New South Wales right of all places, said that he noticed no change in behaviour post-Copenhagen. Albo also said that no one was saying that at the time. In fact, the leader of the Prime Minister's department, Terry Moran, said that there were way worse ministers than Rudd when it came to rudeness and temper. He served under both Rudd and Gillard, so I'm not convinced that Rudd just burned all of his bridges. That leaves two possible explanations. One, Labor was so panicked about polling that they rolled the dice to avoid losing their seats, or two, they were doing what their faction told them to do. As Rudd said, Howard and Keating had won from worse positions, and even just recently, Albo dominated from a way worse position 2 months out. Surely, seasoned politicians would know that knifing your leader just 2 months out from the election can hurt as much as it helps. So I think it's worth looking at this option right here. If you're sitting here thinking, man, Aussie history is way better than I gave it credit for, consider joining the think tank. Annual memberships are now open, and until July the 1st, they are costing half of their normal price. Click the link below to apply, and even if you're short for cash, free members get our reading list, so just let me know in your application. I typically get back on the same day. So Mark Arbib was clearly very influential in the demise of Kevin Rudd. After all, he was BCC'd on Gillard's earlier email, and it was he whom she called on the night of Long Knives. But if we are going to talk conspiracies, we at least have to establish a motive for why the Americans would want Kevin Rudd gone. It's pretty straightforward. The NSA thought he was an alien when they looked at this handball form. End of. Nah, it was really to do with Asia. Kevin did what Kevin wanted. John Howard and George Bush had started negotiations with Japan and India over forming a Quad alliance to contain China. But when Rudd came in, he quashed that quickly and reversed Howard's decision to give uranium to India. So from America's point of view, there was already a sense of who does this punk think he is? But that then got much worse when Rudd tried to form an international bloc called the Asia Pacific Community. Now, to be technical here, Bob Hawke had done something similar when he formed the Asia Pacific Economic Community. This was mainly an attempt to get rid of tariffs in the region. America was cool with that because it had nothing to do with strategic policy. Hawke merely moved a pawn on the international chessboard. However, Rudd had moved the Queen because his community would talk about defense and the military with America's growing rival, China. At no point had Rudd sought the approval of America before doing this. In fact, what you're about to see are WikiLeaks cables from the US Embassy in Canberra, and they're pretty peeved with Rudd. In 2008, America's ambassador wrote home criticizing Rudd for making snap announcements without consulting other countries. His deputy also wrote home criticizing Rudd for too heavily involving himself in foreign policy, even echoing the line, Kevin 747. At the start, it seemed like Rudd had a softer touch towards China. He spoke Mandarin and had been a diplomat there. However, in 2009, he then seemed to advocate for the complete opposite extreme, saying that if the mainland projected force towards Taiwan, America should be prepared to deploy force. For US strategic planning, Rudd was worse than hostile. He was completely unpredictable. Now, my guess is that Rudd made the deploy force comment because he was aware of what the Americans thought of him and he wanted to get them back on side. But obviously, America was in a far better place to make strategic moves in Asia if they had someone who was predictable. So they went digging. So you're about to see another leaked 2008 cable from the American ambassador. This was written the same month that Rudd had launched the Asia Pacific Community. The cable was a profile of Julia Gillard, and McCallum speculated that Gillard was still 8 to 9 years away from becoming the leader. He mentions intel from key Labor players like Mark Arbib and other union bosses, and they told McCallum to ignore the fact that she came from Labor left due to her pragmatism and due to her alliance with the right-wing factions. Perhaps most importantly, Gillard was praised for her understanding of the importance of the US alliance. McCallum also talks about Labor's 2004 election loss. Mark Latham had lost to John Howard after saying that he was too cozy with America during the War on Terror, and McCallum stressed that Gillard had learnt that lesson. Finally, he signed off by saying that if Rudd were to go, it would be unlikely that anyone other than Gillard would be the leader. Okay, so it would seem as though McCallum would prefer Gillard over Rudd to be Australia's Prime Minister. But that's not a conspiracy, we all have our preferred leaders for other countries. But the year afterwards, they keep very close tabs on Julia Gillard. In February, McCallum's deputy told America that the factions might withdraw support for Rudd, and rather than go for Gillard, go for the rising star Bill Shorten. But in June, he then reassured them that Gillard was still on track. The first half of the cable was her being praised for her political skill and for having the backing of the New South Wales right faction. However, in the second half, Clune praised her for her pro-Israel stance. Like McCallum, he suggested that they were at least 2 elections from a leadership handover. The last major leak cable was a profile on Mark Arbib. Like Gillard, he was praised for his political skill, but the cable signed off by saying that he was a strong supporter of the US alliance and had met with them repeatedly. And then WikiLeaks doesn't really have anything else of use after 2009. From the ETS onwards, we don't really know what the Americans were saying about Rudd, nor what they were saying to Mark Arbib. So, what do I think? Coup or not? Look, there's no smoking gun. Like, at no point did McCallum appear in a hologram and tell Arbib to execute Order 66. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For simply a run-of-the-mill internal party coup, Burke was very careful to leave no trace in nudging Gillard. I mean, how much more careful would a foreign country be? To definitely rule out a coup, when Mark Arbib was, spilling all the tea to America, it really would require them just to sit there, listen, and give nothing back. I just don't know how likely that actually is. This is pure speculation, but I find it hard to believe that Arbib wouldn't leave with an impression that America was seriously concerned with Rudd. Having been a Rudd ally in the beginning, he led the New South Wales right faction into a very quick revolt against him. The question is, was that out of fear of jeopardizing a relationship with America, or was it simply just out of fear of losing the election? It could genuinely be about polling as much as it was America. In the years before, he'd been heavily involved in the rotating cycle of Labor leaders in the New South Wales state government. The overarching criticism was that he was simply way too paranoid about polling.
And they've morphed into, frankly, the hollow men who stand for nothing other than following the focus group polling that they're expert at doing, particularly the former ALP State Secretary, now Senator Mark Arbib.
Arbib was the key player who made the move happen. And it does appear as though Gillard received some sort of message when she became Prime Minister. She allowed US soldiers to be stationed here in Darwin, at least on a rotational basis, brought back uranium exports to India, and revived talks about forming the Quad. So here's my final verdict. It was a combination of poll paranoia and concern about what the Americans thought of Rudd. The whole Rudd ran a dysfunctional government thing is a non-starter for me. But what this actually did was change the entire trajectory of our foreign policy. The so-called coup is just one moment in Australia's foreign policy. I do the entire post-war history in 41 minutes right here. In a half of footy, you'll be an expert.